Good morning, Jippy.
Good morning, Mr. Blip. How can I assist you today?
Is there a place called the Door of No Return anywhere in the world?
Yes, the Door of No Return refers to a place on the west coast of Africa, specifically at the Elmina Castle in Ghana. During the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans were held in the dungeons of the Elmina Castle before being transported to the Americas. The Door of No Return is the final exit point from the castle, where enslaved Africans were forced to pass through the door and board ships that would take them away from their homeland, often never to return. Today, the Elmina Castle is a popular tourist attraction and historical site.
When did this transatlantic slave trade happen?
The transatlantic slave trade lasted from the 16th to the 19th century, spanning roughly 400 years. The majority of slaves were taken from Africa and brought to various parts of the Americas, including North America, the Caribbean, and South America. The slave trade is estimated to have involved the transportation of approximately 12.5 million Africans, although the exact number is unknown.
400 years? Oh God!
Yes, the transatlantic slave trade lasted for about 400 years, from the 16th to the 19th century. It is estimated that between 10 to 12 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and transported to the Americas, and many millions more died during the brutal and inhumane conditions of the slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade is considered to be one of the largest and most devastating forced migrations in human history.
What inspired this slave culture in the Americas?
There were several factors that led to the development of slavery in the Americas. One of the main drivers was the need for cheap labor to work on the large plantations that were being established in the New World, particularly in the southern colonies of North America and in the Caribbean. European colonizers originally tried to enslave Native Americans, but diseases and brutal working conditions caused many to die or flee, and the colonizers began to look elsewhere for labor. In the early days of the Atlantic slave trade, European traders purchased enslaved Africans from African slave traders and transported them across the ocean to be sold in the Americas. The demand for enslaved labor grew as the plantation system expanded, and the transatlantic slave trade became a massive, lucrative industry that lasted for centuries. Other factors that contributed to the growth of slavery in the Americas included racism, which was used to justify the enslavement of Africans, and the belief in the superiority of European culture and civilization. Together, these factors created a system of slavery that had profound and lasting impacts on the societies and economies of the Americas.
Plantations? What kind of plantations?
The plantations in the Americas were mainly focused on cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, coffee, cotton, and indigo. The labor-intensive nature of these crops required large amounts of cheap labor, which was provided by the transatlantic slave trade. Many European nations, including Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, established colonies in the Americas specifically for the purpose of exploiting the natural resources and establishing plantation economies.
So European nations looted the Americas?
In a way, yes. During the Age of Exploration, European nations like Spain, Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands colonized various parts of the Americas and established lucrative economies based on resource extraction, including the cultivation of cash crops like tobacco, sugar, coffee, and cotton. The forced labor of enslaved Africans was central to these economies, as they provided a cheap source of labor for plantation owners. The profits from these enterprises went back to the European nations that had sponsored them, leading to a significant transfer of wealth from the Americas to Europe.
Are you saying that the Americans we see today in the USA are once these Europeans?
No, that's not what I am saying. The Europeans who colonized the Americas were mostly from Spain, Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands. They brought enslaved Africans to the Americas to work on their plantations, mines, and other enterprises. Over time, the enslaved Africans and their descendants, along with indigenous peoples, mixed with the European settlers and created new societies and cultures in the Americas. Today, many people in the USA and other countries in the Americas are descended from a mix of European, African, and indigenous peoples.
So, coming back to the Elminas Castle, can you give a description of it?
Yes, Elmina Castle is a whitewashed fortress located on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Atlantic Ocean in the town of Elmina, Ghana. It was built by the Portuguese in the 15th century as a trading post and was later used as a base for the transatlantic slave trade by various European powers, including the Dutch and British. The castle was used to hold captive African slaves before they were transported across the Atlantic. Today, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a popular tourist attraction.
A UNESCO World Heritage Site deserves to be visited. Give me the geographic coordinates.
The geographic coordinates of Elmina Castle are approximately 5.0793 degrees north, 1.3509 degrees west.
How did the transatlantic slave trade end?
The transatlantic slave trade officially ended with the passage of the British Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, which abolished slavery throughout the British Empire. Other European countries, including France, Spain, and Portugal, also abolished slavery in the decades that followed. In the United States, slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, after the end of the Civil War. However, even after the abolition of slavery, racism and discrimination persisted and continue to be a problem in many parts of the world today.
What forced them to pass the British Slavery Abolition Act in 1833?
There were several factors that contributed to the passing of the British Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. One of the main factors was the growing anti-slavery movement in Britain and other countries, which drew attention to the horrors of the slave trade and put pressure on lawmakers to take action. Additionally, the economic and political realities of the time made it increasingly difficult for the British government to justify the continuation of the slave trade. Slavery was also becoming less profitable due to the rise of other forms of labor, such as wage labor and indentured servitude. Finally, the actions of enslaved people themselves, including uprisings and rebellions, contributed to the growing recognition that slavery was morally and ethically unacceptable.
Economic and political realities like?
The British abolition of slavery in 1833 was driven by a combination of economic and political realities. One factor was the declining profitability of the slave trade due to the rise of alternative industries such as textiles and manufacturing. Another factor was the growing abolitionist movement in Britain, which had gained significant public support and political power. Additionally, the slave revolts in various British colonies, such as the Haitian Revolution, had demonstrated the potential for slave uprisings and the need for change. All of these factors contributed to the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act, which marked the beginning of the end of the transatlantic slave trade.
Abolitionist movement? Tell me about it.
The abolitionist movement was a social and political campaign aimed at ending the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in general. It emerged in the late 18th century and gained momentum in the 19th century, particularly in Britain and the United States. Abolitionists believed that slavery was a moral evil and violated the principles of human dignity and equality. In Britain, the abolitionist movement was led by figures like William Wilberforce, who dedicated his career to ending the slave trade and slavery in the British Empire. In the United States, the movement was fueled by both black and white activists, such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and John Brown, who risked their lives to fight for the freedom of enslaved people. Abolitionists employed various tactics to advance their cause, including writing and publishing anti-slavery literature, organizing public lectures and rallies, and even engaging in acts of civil disobedience and armed resistance. The movement ultimately succeeded in achieving its goals, with the transatlantic slave trade being abolished in the early 19th century and slavery being abolished in the United States in 1865 after the Civil War.
So the door of no return has a pretty long and disturbing history.
Yes. The door of no return is a powerful symbol of the transatlantic slave trade and the suffering endured by millions of Africans, who were forcibly taken from their homes and brought to the Americas as slaves. It represents the final departure point for those who were shipped across the Atlantic, often to never see their homeland or loved ones again. The history of the door of no return and the transatlantic slave trade is a somber reminder of the brutalities of human history and the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality.
Thank you for the revelation about the transatlantic slave trade.
You're welcome. It's important to learn and understand the history of the world, even if it can be difficult and disturbing at times.
Bye until next time, Jippy.
Goodbye, Mr. Blip. Take care.